Hello folks, welcome to project 3 of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group Data Laboratory. And in this section, we're going to look at how things can go wrong. Now, that may seem an odd thing to look at. Sure, we just want to find out what's right. But one of the things you have to do when you're finding out what's right is make sure you don't go wrong. So I'm going to start with a very simple graph. It was a graph that we actually constructed in the last section. And what that shows is a measure of international inequality. And it was done in a very simple way. We take the GDP per capita of one group, let's say the South, and we divide it by the GDP per capita of the North. So if that ratio is falling, then the block that we're looking at is getting relatively worse off in comparison with the North. If it's rising, then it's getting relatively better off. So what this data seems to show, quite incontrovertibly, is that the countries we might call the global South, I call them the global South because I want to choose a neutral term, have, with ups and downs, essentially been getting worse off relative to the North since the war, since 1950, which is when our data series start. And that this is different from China, which is not included in the first group in this graph, which was getting worse off until 1990, but then began a process of relative ascent, which became very steep around about 2002, at which time there was also a recovery in the rest of the South, but China overtook the South in terms of its rate of catch-up with the North. So that's a simple story. It's a narrative. The visualization shows that it's so. Could it be wrong? And the answer is, it could actually be wrong. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying simply it could be. And part of what we have to do as data scientists is not only read the tea leaves and say, wow, here's a wonderful prediction that may be true or may not be true, but check. We have to do what's called due diligence and find out if there is a way that we could have misread the data so as to come to a wrong conclusion. And that we generally do by comparing it with an alternative hypothesis. So I'm going to start off with a strange quote, a quote from Sigmund Freud in a work called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And it's one of the more readable of Freud's works. It's very interesting. He even discusses jokes, although it's not clear whether he understands them. And there's a section where he refers to why it is that people avoid conclusions that they find painful. And he describes painful in terms of his psychoanalytic work. So he looks at childhood memories and so on. But then he takes a little digression and he makes this very interesting quote in which he invokes Darwin, in which he says there may be a connection between the infantile reminiscences of the individual and national traditions. Now that's quite interesting because we're talking about nations here. So if there is a connection between national tradition and the way individuals think, then national consciousness might adversely influence the way that individuals perceive data. And it might make them anxious not to look at data that contradicts things they would rather believe, or that makes them feel painful that their country is not performing as well as they thought it should, or that their long-held cherished views about the world are somehow challenged by the data. And Freud makes a very interesting quote from Darwin, and he says, in Darwin's autobiography, one finds the following passage that does equal credit to his scientific honesty and his psychological acumen. So there's two departures here from Freud's psychoanalysis. First of all, he's actually saying, well, one of the reasons that people forget things may not be their infantile experience, but their national tradition. And second, he's talking about two aspects of what Darwin says. One is his psychological acumen, but the second is his scientific honesty. And here is what Darwin says, that he followed a golden rule, that whenever a published fact or a new observational thought came across me which was opposed to my general results, I would make a memorandum of it without fail and at once, for I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from memory than favourable ones. So this painful forgetting, as Freud calls it, is something that scientists can experience. They have careers, they have invested views, they've made money, reputation out of it, or they simply convince themselves of it and it makes rational sense to them, and they find something disturbing, they will forget it faster or be more likely to ignore it than something that confirms what they think. So what are the possible sources of error? Well, of course, there's many, but the two that we're going to look at in this exercise, and we're going to try and use the data in order to demonstrate that we can, it allows us to investigate it. And the two possible sources of error we're going to look at are missing data and misleading measures. So with that said, I'm going to now try and stop sharing this and go to the data itself. So let's see, I think I wasn't showing it anyway, but that doesn't particularly matter at this point because I can build it in at the video editing stage. But the next one is a bit more movement, so I really want to make sure I share that. So I'm going to share a spreadsheet here. Hope that works. Okay, so I am now sharing a spreadsheet, and this contains data that we've actually already looked at. It's done with a pivot table. Now, I'm not going to use this lecture to explain how pivot tables work. Instead, I'm going to refer you to an excellent tutorial. I'm going to try and refer you to one, which is this one here by Leila Garani, called Excel Power Pivot for Beginners. So I'm not going to repeat what she says because you can go and look at what she says. What I'm going to do is talk about some of the conclusions that we get from the data using pivot tables. But I think you should know enough to see that we're looking at the Penwell data set. That's what this filter here says. We're looking at total GDP. The measure we're using is current US dollars. I'm using what's called the clean definition, and I use that in order to make sure that we don't get double counting when there's a transition between one system of recording and another, such as when the Soviet Union disintegrated into its component parts, at which point the data starts recording the individual parts instead of the whole. So we have to clean the data to avoid double counting at the point when that transition took place. And the same actually occurs in the data whenever there's a transition, such as when Ethiopia divided into two parts, when Czechoslovakia divided into two parts, or when East Germany and West Germany came together. So that's what that's all about. You don't need to worry about it too much, but I thought I'd tell you so you knew what it's doing there. And we're looking here just at the south. I've filtered so we're only looking at the south. And I'm using something which I'm going to explain in a bit called the pen geography, which allows us to interrogate that. But first, I just want to look at the data itself. Now, I've organized this in a particular way. These are all the countries of the global south. They're not organized in alphabetical order. They're organized so that we have first all those countries for which data is available from 1950 onwards. So there's a continuous series. I won't scroll across, but if you do it, you'll see. You go right to the end. The data lasts right up to the end. Then there's individual countries, and we're going to study these in more detail later, but they don't have data for all of the years. So the Bahamas, for example, doesn't start until 1970. Some of them don't start even until later than that. I'll try and scroll down till we get to the point where we can see that. Whoops. In fact, you will see when we get going that there's countries that don't start until 1990, as late as 1990. So let's do something a little bit naive. Let's try and calculate the total GDP of the South. And the simple, naive way we might do that is we'll say these are all the countries of the global South, from B10 down to B100. We'll just add them up, and that's what this sum here is. There's another way that we might do it, and that's this sum here. This is B10 to B37. Now, what is that? This only goes down to the countries for which there is continuous data from 1950 until the end of the series. Now, at this point, they're the same. So you wouldn't have thought there's any problem. But let's add in a year here, and let's copy that across so that we get a continuous series. And let's put titles on these, so I'll put restricted series here. Is that restricted? No, that's all countries. And here we're going to put restricted to countries with continuous data. Slightly long, but might as well call it by its full name so that when we do the graph, you'll see what's going on. Now, they're the same at this point, but let's take a copy of that. Control C will get that into the clipboard. I'm going to use a little trick here. I'm going up to the line above because I know it goes all the way to the end. I'm holding down Control and I'm using the right arrow to get me to the very end of that row. I come down again. I now hold Control and Shift. I go back, and that simply allows me to pop the whole thing into here. And the first thing I'm going to do is go right to the end, open up the very last one. Whoops, didn't open up yet. Here we are. And you can see already that the one where we've used all the countries is considerably bigger than the one where we've used the full series. And it's not that difficult to see why. It's because the GDP is going to grow if you add extra countries. Now, how big is that effect? It could be quite small. It could be something that doesn't really need to worry us. A bit of missing data there. Nobody's going to notice it. But let's draw a graph and see how big that is. Try and get a visualization that gives us a feeling for it. So we'll insert a line chart. Here we go. And there's our little chart. It doesn't look that bad, although what you notice is that from here to here, the gap may actually be going a little bit faster than it was here. Hard to tell because we're looking at GDP. One of the things that I want you to do in the exercise is look at GDP per capita, and that you'll see will give you a much clearer idea of the difference that this can make. But let's try and use another visualization to get a picture of how much that might matter. So we'll call that Does It Matter? And we're going to have to put this on a secondary axis, which is a little technique that's useful to do. But I'm just going to divide the all countries by the other. And again, we'll copy it, same method, up one with an up arrow, hold down Control, go to the end, and I went too far, down again, Control Shift, back to the beginning and copy. And let's make that a percent. Now, a little trick here, we want to know by what percent it's bigger than the other one. So instead of a ratio, I'm just going to subtract 1 from that. And I'm going to turn that into a percent here by pressing this percent sign. So now we can see the percent of the damage. There are two ways we might want to look at that. One is to include it in the graph, and I will look at that. But before we do that, let's try a simpler technique, which is just to look at the ratio on its own. So again, I'm just copying the year in here, copy it to end by the method that I've already defined. And let's just draw a graph. This is just a graph of the mistake, the size of the mistake. Now, here's an interesting thing. The mistake gets worse and worse till here, then it goes back down again, and then it goes up again. So there's all kinds of shenanigans going on. But one of the most interesting things that we'll be looking at is from this point onwards, no new countries join. Now, the reason for this discrepancy here is that new countries are joining. But how do we explain the one that starts in about 1990? It means that the group of countries which joined after we got the full data set are growing at a rate that is different from the countries that were there beforehand. Now, I'm not going to say much about that, but I want to draw your attention to it because it gets us into the issue of classification. One other little visualization trick you may want to try is to put all these three series together. And we can do that by removing this row. Don't worry about how I'm doing it. And producing a new graph with all three data series on it. Again, I'll actually make this a new one rather than adding it to the old one. Now, what happens here is, of course, we don't see the third series hardly at all because the numbers are quite small compared with that. We can deal with that with a right click here, format the data series, and I'm going to say we want that to be on a secondary axis. And a secondary axis simply means it's got a different scale and it appears on the right. So now you can see here the chart of the discrepancy and the two data series themselves. When we get really fancy, we can change the chart type, and we can say what we want here is maybe a bar graph instead. Of course, we've changed the wrong one. So let's see if I'll do that again. Change series chart type. Column. Nah, I can't do it. But it's possible to turn that into a combo chart in which this line is a bar chart. These are solid lines, and you can make these actually stand out a bit. You can make them show over and on top of the bar chart, so you can get quite fancy with that. But I'm now going to go back and start to see how the pivot table and the dimensional structure of the geography helps us look at this in more detail. So I'm going to rub out those two charts there, just so that we can look at the data on its own. I'm going to scroll right back to the beginning, and I'm going to do something I should have done right at the beginning. I'm going to freeze these panes so we can see what years are involved, even when we're not looking at that, when it wouldn't otherwise be on the window. Bear with me, freeze panes, and let's keep those years visible. And the consequence of that is when we scroll down, we'll still see all the years and all this stuff up here. So I'm going to now look at this pen geography, which is part of the hierarchy that I've structured here. And I've organized this geography in such a way that there's a category for every series that starts in a given year. Now, at present, we're showing absolutely everything. But we can, if we want, just select the series that start in 1950. And if we do that, we don't see all the others. Our sums will work perfectly if we use that. But we can also, if we want, add in the others, or we can select one. We can say, I just want to look at the ones that start in 1990. Now, you can't see them here because there's no data, but Yemen is what started in 1990. I Control Shift, Control right arrow along to 1989, and there's Yemen. Well, so far so good. We haven't seen much that we didn't already know, but we can use that geography by changing the structure of the pivot table. So here's one I prepared earlier. What I've done here is, if I open up the field list, I've moved pen geography from the filter down to the rows indicator. I actually do it on the original. So if I go back here, sorry, if I go to the geographical entities that I was showing you earlier, in fact, I can simply demonstrate that. We'll drag that down here. And now we're seeing all the various data series, but it's not very clear because we're looking at the countries as well as the groups. So the nice thing about this one is I've collapsed those entities. So we just say, this is the group of countries that joined in 1950. This is the group that joined in 1955, and so on. And you can see each time a group arrives, it swells the ranks of the countries that are counting as the South. possibly misleading us. You can even study which countries are involved. What happened in 1970? Well, all these countries, quite a considerable bunch of countries, arrived. And in fact, you can add up their GDPs, or you can let Excel do it for you by putting in subtotals. And you can see what is the size of that effect on the whole. Now, that's all I want to show you at this point. There's a series of tasks that I'm suggesting, and these are for the most part in a data sheet, and I'm going to finish by showing you where it is. It's a data sheet which has not got all this stuff in it. It's just incomplete, so you have to fill it in. It's got two parts to it. The first is the title page, which has a little bit of explanation, and then these selected tasks here. And there's another one, if you want to go a bit further, which says you can start constructing these pivot tables yourself. You can get the data into your database, MySQL, MariaDB, or if you're feeling exceptionally heroic, you can get it into MS SQL. Good luck. You don't have to do that, but if you're getting bored, that's something you can have a try. You'll soon be unbored by trying all that lot, I can assure you. But anyway, here's what I want to look at. First of all, do what I've done. Calculate the GDP ratio relative to the north of China and the south using both series, and let's have a couple of graphics that show that. Then I want you to look at a different data source altogether. I've said here that's United Nations. That's wrong. I'll correct that when I pop that up on the GitHub. But it's actually, we've used the World Development Indicators, which is produced by the World Bank. So we're going to look at a completely different data set, which allows us to look at another question. Is the result we're seeing a consequence of the people who are providing the data? Now, on the whole, world statistics are reported to fairly good standards, so most people report the same data for the same country, but it wasn't always so, and it still isn't. There are some places where you will find that one supplier will report one figure and one supplier will report another. So it's useful to look at a completely different supplier and see if you get the same result. And it also means, because the world data series is very complete from 1980 onwards, at least, I think 1970, it has virtually all the countries that are recorded in the United Nations, so that's useful. But I want you to look at GDP per capita if you can, because it's there that we really start to see whether the effect of missing data is significant or not. And then the next one, where you'll need to use your own pivot table, is let's look at a different indicator. Let's look at PPPs. And there you will see, I think, a quite significant difference if we use PPP as the indicator to calculate GDP per capita in place of current US dollars. Now, that's all that we need to do for this. There's quite a lot there. Please get in touch the minute that any of this causes any difficulties. I just maybe do one tiny thing, which is to show you where you can find all this on GitHub. GitHub, this is the URL you want to look at. And what you do is you just click here on this folder, and it will show you the current state. Now, I haven't put project 3 in there yet, but after you see this, by the time you see this video, there'll be a third one here saying project 3, and that's where you get the data for it. There's not much there. There's a it's like Freud's a magnum opus on the micropathology of everyday life. There's a PowerPoint with 3 slides in it showing the quote about Darwin, and there's a kind of semi-blank spreadsheet, which is where you're going to start off. So again, good luck. Get in touch as soon as you run into any difficulties, and we'll be seeing you soon. Or if you're a casual observer that's not yet part of the project, feel free to contact me and ask me about this. Bye.